alaikum, everyone. Thanks again for being here. So this is an event organized by Wisdom in Nature, and it's on Story Medicine, a taster of the power of traditional storytelling, a creative gathering on cultural repair and earth stewardship. And we're really delighted to have our guest, Jumana Moon, here leading this session. And Jumana is a traditional storyteller with a great love of stories of all kinds, with a particular passion for stories about the land and the natural world. She especially loves stories from the Islamic tradition, from sacred texts, the Quran and Hadith, as well as a wealth of folk tales, wisdom tales, and stories from devotional poetry and comedic stories of Nasruddin. Jumana draws out the feminine voice and experience in her stories and narrates stories in schools, madrasas, museums, festivals, and a wide range of community events. I'm gonna now pass it on to Jumana. It's just such a great honor to have her here with us doing this. And she's going to talk about storytelling and then narrate a story for us. Thanks, Jumana.
Thank you so much, Mysa. Jazakallah khair. And you know, once again, just really thank you so much to Wisdom in Nature for this collaboration and for inviting me. It's a really heartfelt, wonderful thing to be here with you all. So Bismillah, you know, it's hard to kind of talk about stories in 10 minutes because it's kind of my favorite thing to talk about. So I'm really happy if you kind of just say, Jumana, that is 10 minutes, and now stop and actually tell the story. So I love stories. They're my favorite thing. They've always been my absolute favorite thing. And I want to just start with what is a traditional story, because stories can mean a lot of different things. We have a personal narrative, which is people's life stories. We have authored or literary stories. And how are traditional stories different from those? So, I mean, a lot of storytellers like to say that storytelling is the oldest art form in the world. I don't know if that's true, but storytellers like to say it. It's as if we imagine sitting around a fire, the dark night behind us, the wood crackling and popping and hissing, but above that, in the silence, there hangs the word. And the words meet other words, and the words become sentences, and the sentences fall together into stories. And those stories and those words are passed down generation after generation, uncles and aunts to children, grandparents to children, on and on they go. So these stories, the ones that we tell as traditional stories, can be hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. They're not authored by one person. Rather, they belong to a whole line, they belong to a whole lineage. And people describe this as having a different resonance. A traditional story has a different resonance, a different vibration from an authored story, because they don't come from one mind, they come from a collective experience. And I really feel that the stories take on a life of their own. When you stand up to tell a traditional story, you're not the first person who's told it, and you won't be the last. They live in the minds of people, and the stories travel. Stories are not interested in political boundaries. They've got no interest in that. The stories travel around the world, and you can find a story, and the story I'm going to tell today is a really good example of this, where the motifs or the patterns are the same across many different versions, but that the particular way it's manifested in that country or that community has a particular outer form to it, but essentially it's the same story. A really good example of this is the Cinderella motif, the Cinderella story, which has over 700 versions. There's a version from Socotra in Yemen and various versions from First Nations people across America. So Cinderella is a really good example of that. Most of the stories that we tell they'll outlive us all. They will carry on, which is incredible. You know, sadly, some of the stories get lost and some stories die when keepers of tradition die and those stories are not recorded. And many of us storytellers now, we're revivalists. You know, we find stories in books, which is different from being told a story and learning it in lineage. But for me, our stories, they're our greatest inheritance. For me, there's no greater inheritance than our stories. There's a wonderful poet called Muriel Rukeyser, and she wrote a poem where there's a beautiful line that says, "The universe is made of stories, not of atoms." So traditional stories can take lots of different forms. We have legends, mythology, folktales, wisdom tales, comedic stories, satirical stories. And you can find as well, I think it's important to say, there are kind of mocking, nasty or sharp traditional stories as well. They're not ones I tell very often, but they are there. You do find them. And they must have their purpose also, no? Just like anything else. I think in terms of stories in the land, it's very interesting, and there's a lot of questions to ask about this, because I see stories as traditional stories as repositories of information. I mean, for our ancestors, where would you keep information? Where does it make sense to keep information but in a story? And you can look to some cultures who are, perhaps can we say, are much closer to their fitra than we are. So say, for example, Dreamtime stories, Aboriginal stories, detail very specific creation, or the story of this particular mountain, or this particular tree, or this particular creek. But you also find this in other folk tales as well. Perhaps they're less clearly mapped or less clearly defined. But the further you get into very local stories, the more stories you will find that connect very deeply to that hill, that tree, that forest, that mountain. So the information is stored there. And also you find that stories about plants are a really good example. Shumaisa and I spoke about this as well. And you find that folk tales about plants often tell you something about the quality or the nature of that plant on a not just on a physical, but on a kind of psycho-spiritual level. There's information about the plant stored within the story. And this is how people, I believe, passed on their information. So you can have a physical, you can have a map in a story of a landscape. I've come across that. But also I believe you can have maps for life, maps for the soul, stories that are telling you how to handle situations, what to make of something. And this is when we start to see stories as medicine in so many ways, the shifa that is in a story. And I honestly believe that across all cultures have this quality of shifa in a story, healing in a story, story as medicine. And I think you find as well that these are not strictly linear traditions, and that there was so much cross-pollination. So for example, you find so many stories, perhaps in spiritual traditions that we tell as Muslims, and Jewish colleagues will say, we have this same story, but it's about a rabbi or the rabbi's son or it's about what happened at Shabbat in the synagogue. Whereas for Muslims, it's about the mosque or the imam or going for Jummah prayer. But essentially, it's the same story. And you can see, of course, people met, cross-pollinated, shared ideas, shared stories. Okay, thank you, Shumaisa. So, stories are about understanding self and other. And just really quickly before I move on to the story, motifs and patterns are really important, and you'll see that in the story I want to share. The motifs, as I said, are found in several versions of this story, and that characters in stories can also be aspects of self. So we all have a king inside us, we all have a queen, we all have a beggar, we all have a villain. And so the stories also carry these ideas of the archetypes, or really core kind of psychological aspects of self. The stories work and interact on so many levels. You can hear a story once and you hear something in it, you hear it later and you hear something else. The last thing I want to say before I tell the story that I think is relevant to us is that in the Islamic tradition we have different areas of stories. Quran and Hadith and Seera, which have their own shifa in being told, stories from folktales, wisdom tales, and our tradition of comedy as well in Nasruddin, which is, well, that's a whole other story, as storytellers like to say. So that's a kind of whirlwind kind of taster of traditional story, particularly from our tradition. So I think now it's time to share the story. Is that right, Shumaisa? Yeah, it's right, she's nodding. You knew it would be hard to, once I start thinking about stories. For some reason, I can't tell stories with my glasses on, so I can't, you're all a little bit more blurry now, but I just somehow can't do it. So this story, like I said, is a story that I've found several versions of. I've chosen this version to share today. It's I came across it in a collection of folktales from Sudan. And I really liked the way that the editor, he pulled all these stories together. And I have very close teachers from Sudan. And when I was in Egypt, I met many Sudanese friends who taught me something about warmth and community that I had not experienced before. And so I think that's why I've chosen this Sudanese version. So Bismillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. An old man had lived a long, long life, a good life. But as he lay on his deathbed, something bothered him, and that was his sons. Now his sons were healthy, strong, intelligent, mashallah, but he was worried about their future. They were not quite, well, they were not quite hardworking. They were sort of scattered, and it was hard to bring them together. So the old man called them to him in his final moments. And he said to them, listen, I want to tell you something I've not told you before. I want to tell you about the treasure I've left buried in our field. And the sons were surprised. They'd never heard their father talk about treasure. I mean, they lived in a village and they were farmers. So they were surprised. And they listened to what he had to say. He said, the treasure is buried in the field and I want you all to have it on one condition. You must share it between you. Share it between you equally. And the sons, you know, obviously distraught at their father passing, they agreed. Well, the old man died. And after the period of mourning, the sons began to think about their future. And they said to each other, let's look for that treasure. Let's see if we can find it. And they went out to the field where their father had worked most of his life, and they took their tools for digging, their hoes and their spades, and out they went into the field and they began to dig. They dug the whole of that first day, the whole of the second day, the whole of the third day. It was a big field. Do you think they could find the treasure? No. They dug deeper, they looked, they popped their breath. They couldn't find it anywhere, but honestly, they were excited to find it because their father had told them it was there. And as they dug and as they worked, they thought and they talked about what they would do with their share of the treasure when they found it. The first son said he would buy a magnificent horse, and he would ride through the village and he'd ride through the district, and everyone would admire him on this amazing stallion that he'd buy. The second brother said he would buy a whole new wardrobe of clothes, fine cloth, and he would enjoy looking like a prince around the town, around the village and the whole district. The third brother said he would host an enormous walima, an enormous feast, and he would invite all his friends, and everyone would admire his generosity, and they would have a wonderful night. Well, maybe more than a night if there was lots of treasure, of feasting and merriment. And you might wonder what you would do with all that treasure if you should find it. You might ask yourself, what would I do with such untold riches? Well, still, all the dreaming didn't help them find it. And as they stood there looking, puzzled one day at the field that they'd been digging and digging, their father's friend walked past. He said salam to them. Alaykum salam, ammo, alaykum salam, uncle, they said to him. And he stood looking at them and they said, Uncle, did our father ever tell you of a treasure in his field? No, said the old man's friend, but if you're digging, here. And he gave them a pouch of corn seed. He said, you might as well plant the corn, the rain, the kharif is coming soon. Okay, uncle, they said, why not? And he walked off and he said, wait, but remember to build up the walls of your field to catch the rainwater, just like your father used to do. And they nodded and they planted the corn. And sure enough, just as their father's friend, their ammo, their uncle had said, the kharif, the rains came and the water flooded that rich earth, and soon green shoots were coming through. And they said, we won't dig again until we've harvested the crop. And the crop grew strong and tall and good, and they harvested and they put it in their father's barn. A beautiful, elegant barn on slender stilts to keep the little creatures out. And when it was harvested, they said, now we'll dig. And this time they dug deeper than they dug before. They dug right to the edges of those little walls they built up. They dug around the tree, the favorite tree where their father used to rest, where their father used to pray. What do you think? Do you think they found the treasure? No, you guessed. They didn't. Never mind, they said. Let us plant once again. And so that's what they did. Cycle after cycle of season passed. They even dug the field that their father had not had time or help to cultivate. And their crop grew richer and richer. Year by year, they had to build another barn, just like the barn their father had built on slender stilts to keep those little creatures out. After one harvest, the brothers stood scratching their heads, looking at that field, saying to themselves, where is the treasure our father told us about? And as they stood there, the sun began to dip towards the horizon, And as the sun dipped towards the horizon, this golden light flooded across the land. Those last fingers of the daylight flooded and spread across the land. And it was like golden light fell across their field, and a golden shaft of light fell across their barns, and golden light spilled all over them, all over the brothers as they looked at each other. It was as if the whole world had been dipped in liquid gold. And now they looked at each other. And they looked at the land and the field and the barns. And they began to smile. Golden smiles. It seemed as if the brothers had found their treasure after all. So that's the end of the story. So Bismillah, I'll hand over back to Shumaisa to tell us what we'll do next. I hope I kept to time roughly.